Okay, so my paper is titled Questioning Collaboration, Disagreements at the Intersection of Psychiatry and the Rest of What Is. And I would like to start with this idea of madness or mental illness, and as something that inherently blurs the boundaries between the materiality of life and what Matthijs van de Poort has called the rest of what is. So something that is beyond our everyday reality, but at the same time also part of it. During my PhD, I carried out research on mental health practices, and I focused on the topic Herminia was talking about. So these experiments of collaboration between psychiatry and religious and traditional healing in rural southwestern Ghana. And in Ghana, a key role is played in the mental health care system by shrines and prayer camps. But these sites are also key sites where these collaboration policies that Herminia was talking about take place. So at the beginning of my project, I took this term collaboration for granted. I use it as an analytical category. And by the end of my research, I started actually asking what it really meant. And so I reflected retrospectively on my observations in these sites and on these experiments. At the beginning of my project, it was key for me to deconstruct this idea of an incompatibility between mental health care, psychiatric, biomedical mental health care with traditional and spiritual medicine. But at the same time, I still think that it's very important to focus also on what doesn't work in this relationship. So I also wanted to focus on disagreements, tensions, moral conundrums, doubts that characterize this kind of relationships. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. This is the area where I carried out research, the Nzema area at the border between Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. So I will start with an ethnographic episode. It was a Monday morning when the 15-year-old Fadila and their 20-year-old family friend Dave visited the unit for the second time, as they were asked to do by the nurses during their previous meeting a couple of weeks earlier. Fadila was first brought to the hospital by Dave, who introduced himself, as it often happens, as her brother. The record said that she was diagnosed with psychosis, as she claimed to see and hear the voices of multiple spirits, some of whom looked like cats, and pushed her to attack people. Everything is fine now, said Dave, holding tight a tiny plastic sachet full of antipsychotic tablets. Francis and Harry, two of the unit nurses, asked Fadila to come closer to their desk. They asked her how she was feeling and whether she could still see and hear the spirits. Speaking softly, almost murmuring, she said only sometimes, but she was now okay. She was feeling a lot better than when she first came. Her eyes were looking down, but her gaze was lively and bold. The nurses agreed that she looked healthier. The drugs were working, they commented. Dave, however, was shaking his head. She didn't need them. Her family didn't want her to take them anymore. Francis and Harry looked at each other, then turned to Fadila and said, "What do you think? Do you want to take these tablets or not?" She nodded timidly, but didn't look, at least to me, too convinced either. They repeated the question a couple of times, obtaining the same feeble answer. "She is not mad," insisted Dave, when the nurses started to educate him, to use the term that is often used to talk about this relationship, about mental illness, drugs, and the need to keep taking them even when the sickness seems to be gone, because you never know when it is going to come back. Dave kept shaking his head, raised his voice, and put the tablet sachet on the nurse's desk. What had happened to Fadila was something else. She didn't need any pharmaceuticals. This was her family's decision. After a long moment of silence, during which the two nurses kept looking at each other and then at me, disheartened, Frances, the unit in charge nurse, said there was nothing they could do. The girl was a minor, and from a juridical point of view, it was up to her family to decide for her. Psychotropic drugs are the main tool used by psychiatric nurses to perform their job. And so questioning and or refusing them meant rejecting in toto the forms of care they represented and could provide. After they took off, Henry picked up the drugs Dave had previously brought from the unit itself and turned the sachet over in his hand. He looked outraged. What the family was implying was that Fadila's condition was spiritual, and they knew from their previous consultation with them that she had already visited the shrine of a traditional healer before going to the hospital. But how could they refuse treatment when it was evident that the girl's condition had improved? How could they not understand that? How could they not agree on that? An episode of friction like this, which is not so common to observe at the psychiatric unit, could simply be used to support the hypothesis of a supposed incompatibility between psychiatric care and spiritual conceptualization of mental suffering, an idea that often emerges in common discourses on the possibilities of collaboration between psychiatry and traditional or religious healing. As a matter of fact, together with human rights, ethical dilemmas posed by the chaining and shackling practices that are often widespread in shrines and prayer camps, collaboration is discursively complicated by the ways in which mental health professionals often describe their patients' belief, to use the terminology that is often used, as one of the main factors that actively prevent them from being able to deliver proper psychiatric treatment. As I will try to show, however, such an episode could reveal something quite different. If we reject, as I was saying, I think it is important to do, the idea of an inevitable clash between psychiatric and spiritual visions and practices, what was then the disagreement between Dave, Fadila, and the nurses really about? So Ghana, as we heard, is a key site for the implementation of global mental health policies. There was a new law passed in 2012 that made really Ghana a country at the vanguard of global mental health policies, and also the professionalization and legitimation of traditional medicine in Ghana has a long history started in the 1960s. But at the same time, this relationship between traditional healing and biomedicine is very ambivalent. And these experiments of collaboration, at least in my experience between psychiatric nurses and healers, were often characterized by this idea of not having the possibility to remove them, and so being forced to work with them. So this is a quote: "We are starting to support them because we can't remove them." But at the same time, this relationship is ambivalent because there is, in the common discourse, this opposition between what psychiatry represents, psychiatric nurses represent, so modernity, science, knowledge, and on the other side, we have this idea of superstition, belief, lack of understanding. And so this idea of having to educate the healers and the patients. At the same time, in some cases, this happens often, and also Herminia was talking about it, and Ursula has talked about it a lot. Nurses, of course, can recognize the spiritual interpretation of some illness cases. It's part of their knowledge too. So the main idea that nurses provide when they talk about collaboration is that even if it's spiritual, you still can use the drugs to help you manage the illness. So in my experience, this idea of collaboration happened, as I said, mainly in, outside of the hospital, in the space of the prayer camp or the shrine, and was mainly mediated by drugs that had to be set alongside prayers. So there is this idea of beliefs, people beliefs being a problem. And in my research, I focused a lot on this because from the very beginning, I had the sense that this actually diverted the attention from the material and socioeconomic factors that actually informed people's therapeutic paths across biomedicine and traditional or religious healing. But again, what was the disagreement I was talking about? Really about knowing all the complexities of this context. Was it really just this a moment in which this ambivalence became a real incompatibility, or something else? As I said, what happened during Fadila and Dave's visit to the unit was quite uncommon. In Nzemeland, similarly to many other contexts and for a multiplicity of reasons, which include economic difficulties, severe side effects of the prescribed drugs, and the perception of their inefficacy, and conflict with caregivers, it is quite frequent for people to discontinue their psychiatric treatment. But it is very rare for somebody to embark on a 2-hour journey just to be assessed by the nurses and then inform them about their will to stop taking the medications. Dave and Fadila embarked on such a journey as what the girl's family actually wanted from the unit was in fact something different. They were referred to the hospital by their hometown police station because a woman had reported Fadila for threatening to attack her with a knife while she was in her house. They were asked to bring back a certificate attesting her condition, but the nurses could not agree to sign it if Fadila refused to be their client and to comply with the prescribed pharmaceutical treatment. Something that her family could not accept, as it would have meant admitting that she was sick, that she was mad, while what was happening to her was something else. She was possessed by spirits and on the path to become a spiritual healer. It was some spirits themselves, Fadila called her people, talking through her that told their family not to give her the medications. Indeed, even though the nurses attributed the improvement observed in her condition to pharmaceutical treatment, during subsequent visits to their hometown, Dave, Fadila, and some of her family members maintained that she had never started swallowing those tablets. These few elements are, of course, part of a more complex and layered story that's still in the making and will unravel unpredictably, and yet hopefully in gentle ways for Fadila. What appears evident, however, is that what from a psychiatric angle might be labeled as a lack of insight in the condition is something that seems to encompass the whole caregiving community around Fadila, and also maybe the spirits who possess her, and the idea is that she is not mad. Though it might have been partially triggered by the frustration of not being able to get what they were supposed to, so the certificate they wanted from the unit, the described friction episode could be conceptualized not as a moment of simple tension or mere incomprehension, but as a proper disagreement in Jacques Rancière's terms. In his book on the relationship between philosophy and politics, the French philosopher defines disagreement as a determined kind of speech situation in which one of the interlocutors at once understands and does not understand what the other is saying. It is not a misconstruction which supposes that one or the other or both of the interlocutors do or does not know what they are saying or what the other is saying, other through the effects of simple ignorance, dissimulation, etc. Nor is disagreement some kind of misunderstanding stemming from the imprecise nature of words. According to Rancière, disagreement is not to do with words alone, but is rather something that bears on the very situation in which the speaking parties find themselves. In such a conceptualization, the issue of patients and caregivers' lack of understanding, often evoked in the ambivalent discourse of collaborations, seems to be at the core of the disagreement between Fadila, Dave, and the nurses. It was when Francis and Henry started educating their interlocutors that the disagreement exploded. As observed by Rancière, in ordinary social usage, an expression like "do you understand" is a false interrogative whose positive content is as follows: there is nothing for you to understand. You don't need to understand. And even possibly, it's not up to you to understand. All you have to do is to obey. "Do you understand" is an expression that tells us precisely that to understand means two different, if not contrary things: to understand the problem and to understand an order. Looking at what happened at the psychiatric unit between Fadila, Dave, and the nurses through the prism of Rancière's Disagreement can help us enlighten the power imbalance, so the very situation in which the speaking parties find themselves, that structures their encounter, but also the asymmetrical way in which collaboration is envisioned and proposed at the policy level. This is something crucial, but probably also quite obvious to imagine even without Rancière's help. What is perhaps more interesting, however, is that the described disagreement, conceived of as a mutual understanding / not understanding, developed around two elements: madness and drugs. So what is not madness? What is the purpose of drugs? To explain the ways in which collaboration with spiritual and traditional healers is imagined and performed by the nurses with whom I carried out my research, I often quote something Francis, one of the nurses, told me a few years ago. One of the first time we talked about he and his colleagues' collaboration experiments at local prayer camps. And what he said was, even if it's a curse, you need the hospital, you need the psychotropic drug to deal with it. This explanation that has become almost a mantra for me, probably even more than for my nurse friends, can work apparently well when mental illness is perceived by patients and or caregivers to be spiritual, in the sense that is the result of a curse, an act of witchcraft, an evil spirit possession. But what happens when it is spiritual in another way, when madness might not be madness, but just a transient state to be negotiated with spirits on a path that leads to healing self and perhaps even others? The situated experience of madness that often characterizes the training path of spiritual practitioners is a classical theme. In some stories of both healers and mentally distressed people I had the chance to listen to in Nzemaland, it was described as acting like someone who is mad, but also as a delicate moment in which defying the spirit's will might result in a permanent condition of ezele, the Nzema word for madness. The first time I went to visit Fadila at her house, we were sitting with her, Dave, and some other members of the family when one of the spirits came to her. They requested some objects, a lot of perfumed talcum powders, some cigarettes that were diligently given to the girl by her uncle. They gave pieces of advice to some of us and asked us to read some flipped words Fadila would write on the floor, including her nickname, Vale. When the spirit was gone and she resumed consciousness, she saw herself covered in talcum powder and she started laughing, appearing embarrassed and proud at the same time, as she understood what had just happened, but she did not seem to remember. She knew also from pictures and videos of her that Dave had taken in previous occasions when she was possessed, that she had acted strangely, like she was mad, smoking and so on. Though it was definitely not my place to determine, it was difficult not to wonder to what extent what I had just witnessed was a moment of self-determination in which Fadila was opening herself to what Van de Portes called the rest of what is, and to what extent instead she was responding to other people's expectations, and more specifically in that particular occasion to her family's willingness to let me really understand that she was not mad, that people at the hospital did not understand. By all means, Fadila's spirit possession was forcing me to take seriously the role of the rest of what is in the girl's story. In subsequent meetings, she told me that she was scared at the beginning, but now, after having been to another shrine where she and her family were given a set of strict rules to follow, it was getting easier for her to get to know her people, the spirits, and to somehow manage them. When I told Francis what had happened at her house and I shared with him my doubts, he commented, maybe this girl is already a healer then. So in conclusion, I just want, it's really a temporary conclusion, even if it's a paper I wrote some time ago, but I'm still reflecting on it a lot. And I think one of the key issues that I wanted to raise is the asymmetric nature of the model of collaboration currently enacted by psychiatric nurses in the Nzema area and in Ghana, as also Armenia was saying more broadly. I wanted to focus on this problematic notion of educating people that is, again, very asymmetric and very hierarchical. I wanted to focus on the role of psychopharmaceutical as the only main mediator, at least in my experience, of relationships with healers and patients as a key problematic aspect in the way collaboration is envisioned and promoted. And this idea of a withdrawal from any kind of engagement with the surplus of our reality definitions, the rest of what is in the therapeutic setting. So for me, Francis saying maybe she's already a healer then, so I know what it was about, but I cannot include it within the therapeutic setting I represent. I think it's a key element, and I don't know what to do with it, but I just want to raise it. And this idea of the management of the illness that is done through drugs as compared to the management of the condition that can be done, maybe in Fadila's case, could be done through the relationship with spirits. So again, I think that focusing on disagreement and tensions can be an interesting point of departure to overcome this dead end between incompatibility and just pharmaceutical juxtaposition and envision hopefully truly cooperative projects of care and healing. Thank you. Okay, so now it's Emily's turn, yeah? Va avanti. Poi quando sia all'inizio non funziona, ma poi c'è avanti. Perché c'è un modo per farlo da te? Però cliccare un attimo. Vedrò.
All right, hello everyone. So this presentation is part of my Marie Curie Global Fellowship project. The TRANCE, an acronym that stands for Therapeutic Trance, Transnational Healing, Therapeutic Trajectories in Spiritual Trance, which is founded by the European Union and implemented in partnership between Sapienza University of Rome, Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, University of Oxford, and CRIA Lisbon, and in collaboration with Roger Canals, University of Barcelona. So this research is grounded in a multi-sided fieldwork in the temples of the spiritualist Christian order, Vale do Amanhecer in Brazil, Portugal, Italy, and the United States. This is an order that was founded in the 1960s by Neves Chavez Zelaya, known as the clairvoyant Cianeva, and which has rapidly expanded transnationally in the last 20 years by opening 1,200 temples across the world. And the temples, they work as spiritual hospitals, providing free spiritual assistance to patients through what they call disobsessive healing. That is the release of disincarnated beings that are afflicting the patient with the help of mediums in either conscious or semi-conscious mediumistic trance, who incorporate the spirit guides. And in this research, I looked at how mediumship is learned as part of a therapeutic process, focusing on cases of mental disorder, alcohol, and drug addiction. And I've defined these experiences as transformative. So trance is mediumistic trance, transformative, tackling the processual, therapeutic, and formative character of learning trance. And today I'm going to focus upon some mediums that I've encountered who are patients or psychologists, but also health professionals, so mediums and health professional within the same person, while they practice mediumship in the Vale do Amanhecer in their free time. So it's like a voluntary charitable work. And I look in particular at the ways they articulated these two spiritual and biomedical practices in their approaches to healing, and the correspondences they establish between these practices, which emerge from empirical knowledge. That is how professionals transfer aspects experienced as effective in their mediumistic practice to their professional life, finding parallels between their training and expertise in both fields. And now these illuminated the therapeutic aspects of trance. And finally, how they may suggest new avenues to rethink the communicability between different fields of therapeutic knowledge. And in doing so, I examine the category of experience as a possible pathway to consilience, namely drawing together principles from different theories. I will start with my interlocutors and how they draw healing correspondences to consider consilience at the level of scholarly approaches, arguing that in order to foster consilience in academia, we need to expand the conversation to include the people, the experts on the matter. So I'm proposing a multi-scale approach to consilience at the individual level of practitioners, at the level of theories, and the cooperation between the two. Joanna is a Brazilian psychologist, and in her free time, she volunteers as a spirit medium in the temple of the Vale do Amanhecer in the outskirts of Brasilia. And her experience bridges the domain of spirituality and psychology in her daily life as much as it reflects the complementarity of the approach to healing proposed by the founder of the Vale, Chianeva. And when I met Joanna at her practice, she had just finished her afternoon appointments with her patients, who deal mostly with substance addiction and schizophrenia. As a trained psychologist, she told me that she had experienced doubts when she first trained as a medium, incorporating spirit guides in the Vale do Amanhecer, in this what they call a semi-conscious mediumistic trance. So her major concern regarded distinguishing whether it was the projection of the spirit acting upon her body and transmitting the message to the patient, or if it was her own unconscious. This concern prevented her from having enough confidence to work with patients as a medium in the first month of her practice. Then she said she began to recognize that the knowledge she had of events in the patient's lives and situations before they even began to talk with her in the ritual were far from being accessible, even in her professional therapeutic setting. She noticed that as a medium incorporating spirit, she did not pause to analyze the information passed by the patient as she would in her professional relationship, because she already had the knowledge of the answers, as if past, present, and future were fused in a particular ritual time. As an experienced medium, she told me that, in her opinion, a spiritual practice was a good starting point for a treatment. Quote, "The person who develops mediumship learns that no spirit can act upon herself if it's not allowed. She has a good knowledge of her body and senses, which give it her awareness. Psychology works like this too. As a professional and as a medium, I can make the connection between science and faith, and I can also separate them. As a psychology, I cannot see schizophrenia as a spiritual disorder. As a medium, yes. If a patient tells me, I see ear and a ear, how do I stop them? I tell him, control your body, distinguish what is of this world and what is not. I'm a medium of incorporation. Do you think that a spirit can come and dominate my body? And the patient begins to have less visions, end quote. So her stance reflects the paradox described by Marta Helena Freitas and Bettina Schmidt in their studies on the spirituality of medical professionals in Brazil. That is, when faith and medical practice coexist in their experiences, they're mostly kept separate. This is due to the lack of a specific training for dealing with spiritual experiences in health contexts, experiences that are an essential part of human experience. Yet what her words highlight is a duplicity, which is productive in terms of being able to connect science and faith, although keeping her domains of intervention separate in terms of practice and therapeutic settings. She places the emphasis on control and discernment, which are crucial skills that need to be learned for the practice of obsessive healing, in which mediums must distinguish between themselves and the spirit, between the different categories of spirits, and they must control them. At the same time, they learn to entregarse, that is, to yield or give themselves into their spirit guides while in trance, providing them the space to manifest and pass the messages. These are also essential skills in the psychological therapeutic process, as Joanna pointed out. Besides learning mediumistic trance states, in fact, yielding also emerges as a key trigger of the healing process, according to Paulo, another Brazilian medium, if in the therapeutic relationship in biomedicine, the doctor and the patient yield to their respective roles, which again implies trust. Nora, an Italian medium who worked as a health professional, told me that in the Vale d'Amanhecer, she understood that illness as itself a pre-established formative function, leading to the spiritual evolution of the person. Healing implies a balance between yielding and trust, that one would receive the forces to navigate through that illness. And so yielding, control, trust, and balance are configured as correspondences or transposable, transferable concepts between the spiritist and the medical practices. The epistemology of healing proposed by Ceneva draws upon the complementarity between science and mediumship. In cases of mental disorder, the Vale's mediums distinguish phenomena caused by undeveloped mediumship from mental disorder. They explain that the disorders caused by an undeveloped mediumship disappear as it develops through the practice, and their character is therefore transitory. Mental disorder can be caused by an obsession, also by a disincarnated spirit. But the effect on the psychophysical level are such as to require clinical treatment. In these cases, the development of mediumship may allow the person to gain some control over the symptoms, but it is not possible to treat them completely without clinical intervention. Cases of alcohol and drug addictions are attributed to a particular kind of obsessive spirits and are treated through this obsessive treatment and the development of mediumship. So in the Vale do Amanhecer of Brasilia, there is a non-profit institution called Casa Transitoria do Povo Ipuena, the transitional house of the Ipuena people, that hosts people with mental disorders and addiction for free, offering a joint treatment through healing in the rituals in the temple and sessions with a psychologist, and then there's some social work within the house for the community. And according to one of the staff members at this institution, when the patients decide to develop their mediumship, 70% of them recover without relapse as a result of increasing control, awareness, balance, and personal responsibility. Emotion, bodily sensation, and the sense of self play a crucial role in this process of discernment, and more generally in the development of mediumship, which I have elsewhere defined as a process of enskillment in Ingalls terms, which situates the practice through a continuous education of perception. The point is that healing does not depend solely on the liberation of a spirit or the medical treatment of a symptom, but actively involves the patient at different experiential levels. In the case of my interlocutors in the Vale of Amanhecer, the process of mediumistic development acted on the spiritual, the cognitive, relational, and bodily level. The education and control of the body and embodied knowledge, that is the notion of the body and the self as extended and being multidimensional, have aided their healing process, allowing for self-expansion while knowing how to regulate one's bodily boundaries. And we know that these notions are fundamental to the therapeutic process because the disease causes a fragmentation of the body and a rupture in people's biographies. In anthropology, the association between mediumship and possession in Western psychopathology is considered questionable. However, it is far from being displaced in the medical discourse. And considering the problematization of the process of categorization in psychiatry more in general, James Davis has interviewed the authors of the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, DSM-3, researching the methodology beyond the definition of psychiatric categories. He points out that the DSM-3 categories were more the outcome of a consensus agreement around a given set of behaviors among a small group of psychiatrists, white Americans sharing the same culture and belief, rather than the result of the analysis of research data or biological evidence of illness. And so the cultural rather than scientific modality of setting a threshold to make a behavior pathological resulted in an over-medicalization of emotions as human responses to human suffering. Empirical clinical studies in neuropsychiatry, especially in Brazil with Alexander Moreira de Almeida and Lotufo Neto, are questioning the reduction of mediumistic phenomena to pathology. And the differential diagnosis between the spiritual and the pathological is illuminated by experience. Moreira de Almeida's studies on mediums in Brazil ruled out pathologies, showing that people with mystical experiences scored higher than control groups on the psychological well-being scale, which reflects the findings of Harold Koenig, according to whom religiosity has a positive effect on depression, alcohol and drug abuse, immune and endocrine and cardiovascular systems, well-being and relationships. These studies look at the positive effects of belief on experience, but experience in this case is the result, concerns the individual's relationship with the outside world, and is largely measured through structured tools for collecting spiritual narratives, such as questionnaires and scales. While other studies on mediums in Brazil, such as those by Stanley Gripner, also include psychological and psychophysiological measurements, such as ECG and electromyographies of mediums. But what contribution can ethnography bring to these clinical studies and diagnostic categories? It can certainly shed light on how the notions, processes, experiences at stake in the therapeutic process are articulated by contextualizing them. Whereas experimental approaches tend to isolate the experience in the laboratory, as if the brain that experienced such phenomena could be separated from this socially informed body. Cognitive anthropologist R.B. Whitehouse, in the debate on consilience, argues for the need for anthropology to return to asking the why questions rather than the how questions. However, we must ask ourselves how advantageous it really is to separate the cause from the process. in such an exclusivist perspective, or to reorient the entire discipline towards evolutionary theories. Cultural phenomenological and cultural biological ethnographic approaches, such as those of Sidney Greenfield, Rebecca Seligman, show us that mediumistic or possession experiences, rather than pathological ones, are therapeutic mechanisms. Thomas Shordas among North American charismatics and Sidney Greenfield among Brazilian spiritualists address the rhetoric of transformation in ritual healing, that is, a discourse that once incorporated activates some endogenous processes. According to Shordas, of a psychological kind, creating a new phenomenological reality different from the disease. And according to Greenfield, of a physical nature, that is what he calls altered state of consciousness. Through them, information about the new reality can be transduced culturally and biologically through the brain, releasing endorphins, thus activating the patient's immune system. In the case of my interlocutors in the Vale d'Amanhecer, the transformation, besides being rhetorical, is also experiential. So the relationship between the cognitive and bodily dimension is not to be understood as unidirectional by their mutually constitutive dimensions. If the therapeutic process through mediumistic practices actively involves the patient at different experiential levels, such as the cognitive, relational, bodily, we need what the proponents of consilience call an explanatory pluralism. Anthropology attention to the process through which notions of the body and the self are transmitted, learned, and articulated in spiritual healing may constitute a crucial contribution to those clinical studies that begin to consider experience as a key point for a differential diagnosis. It is certainly necessary to find new ways to encourage collaborative ethnographies and promote multidisciplinary academic events. But it's equally important to consider consilience in a broader form of the relationship between these disciplines, in order to include in what Bradshaw defines as an expansive conversation of consilience the different actors who operate in this field of spiritual healing, and so to reflect upon how they trace correspondences in healing practitioners, in healing practices. In my transnational research, I found that cooperation may happen at these different scales. So within individual mediums who are health professionals rather than between mediums and health professionals, but also at another level, understood the spiritual, and this emerged during fieldwork in the US, in this temple of the Vale d'Amanhecer that is set in a Brazilian neighborhood in this building where there are several groups. So at the first floor, there's an evangelical church. At the second floor, there's a Kardecist center where they do spiritual surgery and Kardecist rituals. And just in front of it, there's the doors are open into the temple of the Vale d'Amanhecer in like a loft, an open space of this building in Newark. So when I asked them, how do you interact with the other groups? You're in the same building. I mean, outside there is there are these signs to all these different spiritual centers at the door, and they told me, well, we don't really interact with them as representative of each center, but what happens is at a spiritual level. So on the one hand, this was a former brothel, and the Vale d'Amanhecer was set in the gambling room, and on the other floors they're performing the ritual. So we're actually cleansing the history of the place, the energetic history of the place. And then on the other hand, it may happen that it happened once that in the ritual, in the spiritist center, the Mesa Branca, or the Kardecist Mesa Branca, they were not able to elevate, to release the spirits that were there. So the representative of the center asked God to help them to release these spirits. And suddenly the Mesa Evangelica, which is a Vale ritual doing practically the same thing, opened on the other side of the same floor, and the spirits were released, and the ritual in the Cardiac Center returned to a kind of calm and balance. So they were like, well, here the spirits may cross one center to another, as they do the patients that end up their rituals in, they finish their rituals in the Cardiac Center and then come and pass as patient in our rituals. So I found this kind of cooperation fascinating to rethink another scale of cooperation. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have Helmar Kurz's paper, Healing Cooperation of Humans and Spirits, Mental Health Care in Brazil.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having me there, at least virtually. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see the screen, the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see. If you want, you can put it on. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we kind of like stay in Brazil, and we also stay in the area of spiritism. Just that I did not research on Vale do Amanhecer, but on Cardiacism and Cardiacist mental health care in Brazil. So let me start with some two brief case studies that are interrelated. The one is of Elisangela, that she is psychiatrically diagnosed with a bipolar psychotic disturbance and is treated in a psychiatric hospital, receiving drugs and psychotherapeutical and psychological treatment. And with time, I learned from her that her illness started after the death of two friends of hers. And she tells me that what is symptoms that really afflict her is that she listens to voices. And these voices are cursing on her, really saying evil things on her, really putting her down in many different ways. And what happens is that in this psychiatric hospital, and I'm going to introduce it afterwards, there's also some spiritist volunteers that kind of like complementary to the treatment with drugs, work with patients spiritually. And there she kind of like learns who is cursing her are exactly the two friends that died, because she comes to the conclusion, at least this is what she told me, that she foresaw their death somehow, but she didn't warn them. And so she thinks that she's guilty, that she could have done something, that she has mediumship capacities, but didn't use them, and this way causing the death of her friends and now suffering from that. The other case story is of Regina, that she is one of the spiritist volunteers that go to the hospital that also work with Elisangela. And she had very similar experiences, first after the death of her father, and then years later of the death of her husband, that she would also listen to voices, this time not cursing her or so, but quite the opposite, telling her how much they love her. But it was all the time, whenever she was falling asleep, every night came these voices, my daughter, I love you, or my wife, I love you. And she also felt it as very disturbing, listening to these voices. So what she did was going to Spiritist Center, and she was told, yeah, that this is mediumship and that she has to develop that in a way. So we have two very similar stories after the death of beloved persons that develop very similar. The one becomes a psychiatric patient the other one becomes a medium helping psychiatric patients. So that just as an opener. So what I will talk about today is a little bit of my research. What did I do? What was the context, my questions, the topic, and so on. I will introduce very briefly some spiritist epistemologies of care, which Emily already referred to many of them, and then bring some insights from my perspective of medical anthropology and transcultural psychiatry. So the context is, of course, first of all, Brazilian psychiatry and Brazilian anti-psychiatry movements, which psychiatry in Brazil kind of like really repeated the development of the European history of psychiatry when I talk about social exclusion, forced treatments, medicalization, and so on. And of course, this was even more the case throughout the Vargas fascism and the military dictature from the 60s to the late 70s. So based on these experiences, after the fall of the military dictature, and especially since the 1990s and the 2000s, there's going on a process of deinstitutionalization of mental health care. That means public psychiatric hospitals are closed, and one builds more upon these centers of psychosocial attendance. And there's some clinics that can have psychiatric wards or paid by the public Brazilian free healthcare system, SUS, or by private health plans. But most pure psychiatric hospitals were closed. Which is, first of all, a good idea to bring people back to their communities and back to their social networks to be treated there. However, we have a problem in Brazil in public health care that is very ideologically ridden, but also very corruptive. That means the idea is good, but the politics does not provide the resources to establish these new networks. So mental health care facilities are closed without bringing other resources, which is where many religious and spiritual agencies and countercultures step in to kind of like fill the gap, as we already listened before. So my questions then was, how do spiritist epistemologies and practices contribute to mental health care in these uncertain times as people experience them in Brazil? And how do maybe different approaches interact, integrate, cooperate, or compete or even counteract? And what new methods may arise here in terms of a healing cooperation or integrative care? Just a second. So as I said, I was most interested in this spiritist approach to mental health, which, you know, we have this spiritist continuum in Brazil, where European, Asian, Afro-Brazilian, and indigenous resources and traditions kind of like intermingle and interact, whereas I kind of like focused on Kardecism, that I believe has a high importance for mental health care in Brazil to or complement public health care, or sometimes even substitute it. And there's a special format of spiritist psychiatry. You see on the picture the Hospital Espírita de Marília, where I did most of my research. That is a psychiatric hospital administrated by spiritists. There is resources by the state, by the public healthcare system. There are psychiatrists, medical doctors, psychologists, nurses, and so on working, but it's administrated by spiritists, and spiritist volunteers engage here. And kind of like coming from different institutions, so-called spiritist centers of the town, to contribute to the care and well-being of people over here. Another step that is not so important in my today's talk, but what was also interesting for me, is that this coincides with the global increasing request for so-called CAM, where people kind of like look more for holistic, sustained and spiritual treatments, with also the phenomenon of medical tourism, that is many people, for example, from Europe or Australia, come to Brazil to receive healing there in Spiritist centers. And vice versa, Spiritist Brazilians also migrate to the world and implement their practices there. I did multi-sited ethnographic research, mainly in Marília, which is in the state of Sao Paulo, relatively wealthy state and inland. And for comparison, I did research in Bahia, in a town the same size, more or less, Itabuna, but in a relatively poorer area of Brazil, and also in Munich in Germany, which you don't see on this map, in a center where Brazilian immigrants and Germans interact to kind of like develop their spirituality and find answers to affliction. I did participant observation and sensory ethnography, which I already mentioned yesterday. Did many narratives, semi-structured and expert interviews, and also some autoethnography, reflecting my own emotions and experiences in the field, which is also not so much the focus of today, but mainly my participant observation and what came out of the interviews. So let's come to epistemologies of care. So first of all, we have a very different concept of a person or self in Spiritism than we have in psychiatry. In psychiatry, you have the Cartesian model of a body-mind that has two different spheres, whereas in Spiritism, you have a body that is material, biological, and dies at the end of the life. But it also has a spirit that goes through many lifetimes, gets reincarnated many times. And these two spheres are linked through the so-called perispirit, that is a subtle body. It reminded me a lot yesterday in the talk of pranic therapies, where we have these different spheres. And there are even people in Spiritism that see the perispirit as very different layers of subtle bodies. This subtle body connects kind of like the material body and the spirit for a lifetime. And here is where a lot of illness and healing happens. So as I say, they believe in the reincarnation of the spirit. And this way we also accumulate karma and kind of like have to spiritually develop towards something like perfection or spiritual progress, which also means to care for myself means that I care for others. So also like in the Vale, also here charity is a huge thing. But another aspect of caring for others is to kind of like tell patients about the Spiritist doctrine, about spiritual impacts of illness and healing, and providing this passy that you see down there, where people kind of like energetically try to help the perispirit of the person. On the top, you see a picture that also Emily referred to, that alcoholism of a person can be related to a link to a spirit that kind of like in lifetimes drank a lot himself and now kind of like links to a living body to continue with this need of drinking. And this is what we call obsession. Emily already mentioned that afflicting spirits that link to us, they can produce illness. And so then what has to happen is to do disobsession, to kind of like get rid of these spirits. And this practice people learn in mediumship training, where they can interact with these spirits to kind of like find solutions. So this only as a brief introduction to the field. So what I observed here is that there's very different levels of healing cooperation. On the institutional level, we have kind of like Spiritist institutions and agencies, and the psychiatry and the biomedicine institutions. which I have been talking and writing about this a lot in this edition of Curare on healing corporations that we published 2018. And where I also kind of like reflect on the need of cooperation if we want to provide global health, as critical as this term is. So I will not go so much on this, just saying that in Marilia, where I did my main research, I really see a symmetric level of cooperation, very different from the examples that we listened earlier today with asymmetric relationships. But here, doctors and psychologists and spiritists work on an eye level, because also many of the psychiatrists and psychologists are spiritists themselves. So they kind of like bring these two things together. Whereas in Bahia, I found more of what has also been mentioned today already, the example that spiritists more substitute the public healthcare system because of lack of resources, especially in the poorer areas and favelas, where people simply don't have access to healthcare or mental health care, and thus going to spiritist centers. So this is kind of like the relationship between institutions. In Germany, of course, it's totally different. There's very asymmetric. Public health simply doesn't accept spiritual approaches, as much as people in Munich try to implement, but it's very difficult. And then, of course, we have the interhuman level, where people, in terms of caring for themselves, like Regina, for example, in my story in the beginning, they have to help others, like Elisangela, for example. So care and self-care of different people are kind of like interrelated. So we really have here a bio-psychosocial spiritual approach that also had been mentioned earlier in this conference. However, what I find really interesting is that we also have a level of healing cooperation here between human and spirits, or what is more, as was said before. That is, on the one hand, that in many spiritist centers, we have spirit doctors. Like, you know, the story of Dr. Fritz, for example, that Greenfield talked about. I met many other spirit doctors, that is, doctors that deceased, and now through a medium treat people. Very funny is that most of these doctors are Germans. So, I mean, I met Dr. Hans, I met Dr. Frederik, I met Dr. Wilhelm, a bunch of Germans. With this, we could fill a whole nother presentation of why is that. But the other level of human and spirit interaction happens in mediumship and disobsession. And this is what I find very interesting. This is a room inside the hospital of Marilia, where every day happens disobsession meetings, where people sit around this table. The room is darkened, prayers are said, some spiritist readings are done. And after some time, mediums incorporate spirits that are obsessing patients of the hospitals. The patients are not in the room. They don't know nothing of that. It's really something of dealing with this spirits. And the practice is always the same. Some orienteer gets into conversation with the spirit, tells the spirit about their misbehavior, and kind of like guides them with the help of benevolent spirits to a hospital on the higher plane. So it's not only the patient in the hospital here that needs support, but it's also the obsessing spirit that needs support. And through the people working in this disobsession meeting, and those benevolent spirits kind of like working on the hospital on the higher sphere, in this cooperation of these humans and spirits, the patient is helped and the obsessing spirit is helped at the same time. So this is kind of like very much another form of healing cooperation that I observed over there. So, and with this, I already come to the end. I mean, we could very much more discuss all this data on a more theoretical level, But what I find important here, and I mentioned that yesterday in the book launch also, what happens over here, first of all, is that patients receive explanatory models for their afflictions that do not stigmatize them, that do not socially exclude them in terms of like, oh, something is wrong with me. No, there's something wrong in my social and spiritual relations. And this can be resolved when I kind of like engage spiritually. So this means patients also receive some agency. They don't stay passive, pumped up with psychotropic drugs or the like, but they can kind of like participate in their recovery process and kind of like learn to develop coping strategies to overcome their affliction, and in a further step, then also start to help others in terms of care and self-care. Okay, that was it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now we have Serena Bindi. Sì. Okay, so the paper is called Experiences of Grief and Presence of the Dead Between Mediumship and Psy-related Practices. The floor is yours.
Yes, thanks. So I coordinate since 2020 a multi-sited research which is being funded by the Agence Nationale de Recherche in France. We are 11. It is, as you can see, international and interdisciplinary research network. Scholars are based in India, US, France, Greece, Italy, Nepal, United Kingdom. David Ettore is part of the team, Sumit Jain and Bob Desjarlais in US, Aidan Seal-Feldman, in UK, Sumit Jain, Liana Chase, and Pianoel, in Greece, Diana Riboli, and in France, Marie Manganelli and Florence Alder. Then we have also a few psychologists in India and in Nepal who are part of the team and assist us with this research. The program deals with the way people relation with the dead and their subjective experience of losing a dear one are being eventually reshaped in a particular moment in which in the whole central Himalayan region, new psychiatric and psychological languages are being introduced. I will present in this talk the material stemming from my own fieldwork, which is carried out. So here you can see the North India and Nepal, which is the area, the central Himalayan region, the area where this research is carried out. And in the following, you can see the state where I work, Uttarakhand, in particular, one of the districts of the state, which I will not mention here. But basically, in this district, I'm following out a community-based mental health program, which I started in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. And this program is run by an NGO, which is co-funded by a private hospital and by a private foundation. And basically, the program has started by training in this area 32 girls. The girls belong to the same village, which are the beneficiaries of the program. Girls are aged between 25 and 45 years. And they'll be trained into what mental health means, what's mind, what is body. And two kinds of mental disorder exist: severe mental disorder, common mental disorder. They've been trying to recognize what is the difference between these two disorders, and to do what they call door-to-door. So basically, each girl has the responsibility of 4 to 5 villages. They have to go in each house to spread awareness about these two kinds of disease. And they can provide forms of counseling, or they call it active listening, to people who they think they suffer from common mental disorder, and they should refer to psychiatrists, which are not present in the area, but this is another issue, to psychiatrists and doctors. So in the capital, basically, people who they esteem being affected by severe mental disorder. You might know there are in India famous case. Here you can just see an example of an encounter, this door-to-door, in which community mental health go to see different house and to give awareness about this different resistance of mental health problems. Because it's like this that really they formulate their work. So basically, as you might know, there are in India famous example of collaboration of spiritual healers and psychiatrists. Especially, it was quite famous, the Dava and Dua project in 2008 in Gujarat, in which a psychiatric hospital was created next to a famous shrine. And so they were giving psychiatric care to patients visiting the shrine. But this was studied, among other people, by Ellen Basu. You might know her work. But in this case, healers, local healers, are not considered as therapeutic partners. On the other side, they're not invisible, completely invisible, because they are present in the project and in the website and in the training of the NGO. They're called boundary partners. Boundary partners, together with village leaders, together with ASHA workers, which are other mental health workers financed by the Ministry of Health and already present in villages. What are these boundary partners? I quote what community worker, the girls who work as community worker, one of them tell me. Boundary partners are people who facilitate our project access in the villages where we have to work, but where we don't know people. So they can help us by introducing us more families, and they help us to organize awareness meetings where we spread knowledge about mental health and about our programs activities. So these awareness meetings, like other activities carried out by this program, should allow, according to the physician who has initiated the project, the dissemination of correct information about mental health. Correct information about mental health, I quote, also implies to overcome the beliefs related to spiritual care, such as beliefs in ghosts and spirits. We consider them superstition. In other words, in a quite paradoxical way, the collaboration of religious healers is sought to a large extent to help overcoming the knowledge on which their own practice is based. So there is a common term, you know, in health policy used to justify intervention, which is a treatment gap. So here, this project started to fill a treatment gap in mental health resources in Uttarakhand. But the term gap render invisible a whole range of practitioners which are in the area. And which are actually involved in the field of mental health as well, and health in general. In the area, most of the healing is going on through practices that I wouldn't maybe call trance, but of course they are, or implying the fact that the healer is possessed by or is collaborating with invisible beings, spirits of the dead, spirits of the place, or deities. There are mainly two kinds of figure. Some healers do healing by feeling such presence in their bodies, either through material such drums, rice, or wooden palanquin. You can see rice or wooden palanquin. So these are different material technologies to which the persons feel and collaborate with invisible presences. Or there is another form of healer in which the healer is not in self-possessed, but he possesses ritual techniques of especially rhythmic techniques, allowing entities to possess the body of people participating in the ritual. We come back to this later. So on the other side, we should say that there is not in this area and there is not in this program any explicit discourse against healing. So, you won't see in training given to community workers, people say, tell them not to go to see healers. On the opposite, there is a discourse of tolerance. We should tolerate them. This discourse is conjugated in two main ways. Now, we could say much more about it, but I'm trying to summarize. I think that there are two main positions on the side of the trainers, the people who come to train community workers. One is, okay, we should tolerate spiritual healing because we shouldn't lose the trust of people from village. I mean, if we go to village, we say that you shouldn't go to see your healers, we lose their trust, they won't follow us. So we don't say much about it, and slowly we hope that this superstition will fade away. The second discourse, also based on the idea of tolerating their presence, is that we can actually allow people to go to see their healers because this can reduce their stress. So there is a certain, okay, the idea is the placebo effect, of course, behind this. So there is an idea that tolerate their presence to a certain extent. People should understand that these healers don't heal them, but it is also good if they go because this can lessen their stress. What these two positions have in common is that, as has been said already this morning in other fields, they don't take seriously the epistemology on which healing is based. So the entities who are responsible for the illness, entities who are active and agent of healing, the aim of the healing process. So even the position who is tolerating them because they reduce stress, it is not taking into consideration and taking seriously the epistemology. On the side of the healers, this kind of ignorance, the fear of being ignored because there is not a real dialogue with them, reflect in a position of they ignore more or less the community workers. They did not really understand the interest of this program, and they don't do this referral work they should do, no, according to this community-based. They should refer patients which they feel they're sick. They should refer them to they don't do, but they don't feel threatened either. They also don't feel competition. They don't feel that they will lose clients because of these NGO workers. So now we come to patients. You have understood that our interest is really the subjective experience of people who find themselves in the middle of this epistemological pluralism that have to coexist with these pluralities of idioms, of nosologies, and how they do it. We try to study it with a person-centered approach and with a critical phenomenology understanding of what is happening. So, as we can see, there are coexisting epistemologies which ignore each other, which are not really in dialogue, and this can lead to difficult situations from an experiential point of view. I will provide here one case study which illustrate these difficult consequences which from an experiential and existential point of view. This case relates to the experience of losing a dear one, not only because our research team is working on this team, but also because I feel, and that's why I create this project on loss and grief, that this is one of the areas right now in this region of the Himalaya where we see most strongly the existential problem, the hesitation, the doubts that such coexistence of idioms is causing. Why? Because according to local etiology, there is a whole series of physical sensation, hearing voice, but also some kind of pain, discomfort, people who go to see an oracle. And often these symptoms, which are not symptoms, are signs in this framework. They are considered to be caused by a disease, but usually a disease that has suffered an untimely death, someone that has died in a violent way. So the dead are caused are supposed to cause these problems because they want to attract the attention of the living. They want to be nourished, they want affection, and especially they want dialogue. So you need to organize specific ritual you'll see here. To allow the dead to come into the living. They come together with many other deities, so they don't come alone, the dead. And in these ceremonies, there is an important dialogue between dead people and deities, and between the dead and the family. At the first of this ritual, there is a proper negotiation in which the dead will negotiate where he want to be installed. It can be in like you can see, and it can be maybe in a stone, maybe you want to be installed in a murti, in an icon, in a wooden or in a silver murti, or sometimes it can be, you want to be in a necklace, and he will choose the necklace being carried by his mother, by his widow. And then you have another image of a temple with the different dead of the family who have been installed inside. But in most cases, the dead decide not to be inside a house temple, but they want to be outside in little temples along the road. Every 3 to 5 years, this ceremony of dialogue with the dead will be organized again. Usually the dead will manifest again through symptoms, causing illness to someone in the family, and again, we will enter into a dialogue with the dead. As you can imagine, such practices are completely at odds with psy-related languages of dealing with grief, which have been freshly introduced in the region by the intervention I just mentioned. This intervention is supported by a secular epistemology, which, of course, does not attribute an ontological but a psychological status to this presence. They are not phantoms, they are fantasies. So we are right now confronted to this situation in which on the one side there are phantoms, as I described you, meaning dead with which you interact, which are ontological present. On the other side, you have fantasies, imaginary entities. They are imagination over persistent in the patient mind. They produce vision, belief, form of delusion. So the question, our main question is how do people navigate between inconsistent epistemologies concerning the present and action of the dead in the world of the living, and how this might impact their subjective experience of loss. So the case I wanted to speak about today concerns Snea. Snea is the wife of Manoj, which is one of the mental health program coordinators, because before he was working since the beginning for this project. Snea is his wife, and they are both born and they live in one of the villages which is beneficiary of the project. In the aftermath of actually, the sister-in-law of Snea died in a very sudden, accidental way. In the year following this death, so this untimely death, a few times Snea was on the point of being possessed by his sister-in-law. Her husband tell me, I saw her. She was opening her eyes wide. She was staring. She was starting to shake. But I scolded her straight away, and she immediately returned to normal. I don't want some scenes in my family. We are both educated people. I learned from the program that these behaviors are not good for her. They're also not good for her sister-in-law. My wife is depressed. She's in shock over the death of her sister-in-law. She has tried several times to shake. But if she does not nourish this feeling, it will pass. My brother is not happy. He would like my wife to tremble, meaning to embody his wife. But you know, we have to get rid of this superstition. So, to come now to the discussion of this case of Snea, we can see that as the result of the education that Manoj has received as community worker, now as project manager from the NGO, he's preventing his wife from being possessed by her sister-in-law. Just a moment. By doing so, he's also preventing his own brother to be in dialogue with his deceased wife. So, Snea has some physical symptoms. She trembles, she has some bodily feelings, but they're not considered as a result of a ghost presence, but the result of a fantasy, or rather an emotion, depression, shock, to be controlled. This case shows very well, I think, the difficulty people might feel in this moment to handle different and sometimes conflicting definition of the appropriate ways to managing emotion relating to loss. Managing emotion of longing, nostalgia, is central to both ritual healing and to psychological one, but in opposite ways. Rituals want to heal the dead. The main finality of this ritual you have seen before is to speak with the dead, and they try to tell, I mean, the whole ritual is really concerned with the dead emotion. You should let it go. You should go. We love you. You love us. Tell us what you want. Let it go. You'll be happy. So you see that very well that nostalgia and is attributed to the dead. And the finality of the healing is to heal the dead and guarantee the psychological well-being of the dead person. Conversely, as you would know, the main goal of counseling, of psychological practices, also of this kind of words that Manoj is telling to Snea, is to heal the living. They attribute longing to the living, in saying, she misses her sister-in-law. And the aim is helping the living to overcome the feeling of longing. So such experience as the experience of Snea show us the extent to which it's not easy for subjects to cope with this change in emotional rules that seem to be going on in this area. There is also another important factor here. As you have understood, there is a structural function. There is a collective healing function of ritual. The presence of the dead, the dialogue that you might have with them, it's very important for the family. It's important for a widow to decide that it's time that you can remarry. It's important to children during this ritual they go and hug their mom or their dad who has that. It's important for the family to discuss family issues, sometimes concerning the land or some problem with the neighbor. So there is a clear role of this ritual in structural and local society. They allow to discuss problems, they expose tension in social relationship, and they help reestablishing norm and responsibilities. So, as you can see in the case of Snea, when we tell people that they shouldn't do, what in this society we replace this. There will be some change. It's up to us to see how people will do to find other way to keep the dead alive, other ritual to have this restructuring and dialogue and important structuring and function. I don't know. This is an open question. So coming back to the issue, I started from this idea that there are epistemologies in the field. There's no dialogue among these epistemologies. But as you might understand from the case of Snea, the thing is that this epistemology, they're not just in a vacuum. They are embodied. They are naturalized by the subject to their practices. These assumptions do not only produce specific modes of thinking about the dead. They are felt, they are lived, they are experienced, they affect the person bodily, aesthetically, and emotionally. They expect the thing that she feels in her body is there. You can tell her this is not her, your sister-in-law, but she still feel it. They affect the way she will feel the emotion she will feel. She feel that her sister-in-law needs this ritual. So in this perspective, the dead are just not object of mental representation. They are also anchored in a way of sensory perception and the somatic state. And so the problem of this pluralism is that there's not only epistemological clash, there's also epistemological, there is also a clash between way of feeling or sensing your body. So when representation change, because a psychiatry, a psychological concept will tell you what to do, what the dead is, your sensation will stay, your feeling will stay. What to do with this sensation, with this feeling in a new epistemological framework in which they are not anymore considered as a sign of an ontological presence of the dead. So the aim of this project is to explore these complex processes of reshaping of both experience of physical and perceptual disorder and the disease presence and action in this world. But also, and I have no time to develop here, another aim, we have been thinking through how to create space of dialogue, to create a dialogue among, in the communities between healers and community workers with which I'm in touch. Space of dialogue, we have thought are plays. So we work in production of plays with villagers, in which they would represent their experience, the way of experience grief and the presence of the dead. And we also started some photo voice project in which we also ask people to take photo of what their experience is. So my hope here is also to get idea on all these methodological and ethical aspects of the project to which we would like in which we would like to work. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, a lot of very stimulating presentation, but we have to wrap up, I think. I don't know, we don't have time for any questions. Perhaps one burning questions or, yeah, comment. Yeah. Yeah, one question, we can do it. Do you want to come here so people from home can hear you?
So just one question and one thing I was like thinking, hearing all your amazing presentation. One for Serena, I was wondering if on the field they are using telemedicine, and I'm wondering if it is the case, if there is an impact also on how like the health worker are being perceived by the local community. That will be one question. And the other thing I was wondering about is like hearing how there is this complexity, this complex relationship between these two health systems, right? Like the allopathic and non-conventional one, and how there is point of tension and conflicts and ambivalence, and then how people manage to find a way through it at some point. You know, I was wondering to what extent the concept of working misunderstanding, the concept of drawing on what Marshall Salins has been speaking about, you know, like how like malentendu productif, I don't know to say it in English, malentendu productif, how it can be a concept which can be applied, you know, on these issues we are trying to think about. That's what I was thinking.
Thanks for this question. I'll try to be short, then we can speak more in the coffee break. Yes, thanks. Actually, the telemedicine is not present in the area, or in other areas in India, yes, but not in the area. And also, which is very paradoxical, there is a spreading of awareness about mental health issues, but there is not access to mental health resources. There's only one doctor, which is not even a psychiatrist, is a general doctor, how you call, general doctor, which is received a very short training by the demands in Bangalore, which is the Institute for Mental Health. So basically, people don't have access to psychiatrists. There's no psychologists. There's just these people that are community workers, which have been training very fast to active listening, and access to medicine, to mental health, different kind of medicine for depression, antipsychotic. It depends on the moment. In some area, they get access to medicine, so they can be prescribed by the generalist, can give the medicine, they can take them. In some other areas, the monitors don't receive the medicine. So basically, people have to travel 5 to 6 hours to the capital city to see a psychiatrist. They should go there every 1.5 months. The negotiated with the doctor should be 3 weeks, but because it's a mountain area, they can go every 1.5 months. But still, who has the money in these mountains to afford a trip and then to have a place to stay in the capital city? So there is a problem because there is really like a temporality gap in a way, spreading awareness, but not having access to mental resources is really. And for the second question, yeah, it's a very important input. So if I understood your question, how the fact, even if you don't understand, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, actually, I think that they present a bit more than me optimistic way of, especially Emily. I was thinking maybe my paper is a bit pessimistic, but it's not. It's not. There are also cases in which people actually they can these different therapies coexist in people's experience. Some people manage, to just feel okay. I did my ritual, but I was more interested in people who experience problem in this moment, because I found that the NGO that is doing so much good work. I don't want to give the impression that the NGO is doing so much good work for some people, especially psychotic cases. People who are really suffering and they're getting now knowledge people are schizophrenia case. But I was really disappointed by this lack of respect and lack of taking seriously their epistemology. So I was really interested in how people experience this clash in their subjective experience. But then there are also cases in which these I have to think it through for the next conference.
Thank you very much. So we have to close here, even though it could have been a very stimulative conversation, and I hope we will have it anyway. So now we have thank you also, Helmar, and the people at home. I think it was really, really interesting, and we will see you later after the break.